Hello and welcome to an interview with Amy Gallagher, who is a mental health nurse and psychotherapist in training, who is suing the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust for a whole host of reasons, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this case has received coverage from The Times, The Telegraph, The Daily Mail, and Lawrence Fox, who has appeared on our podcast before, and is obviously a friend of ours. So how's it all going so far? And of course, thank you very much for coming as well.
That's okay. Thank you for having me. How's it going? It's going okay. I mean, the Tavistock are still treating me not very well. It's still ongoing. Got some current complaints that we're still waiting to be resolved. But the coverage has been good. It's good to get my crowd funds going okay.
By the way, that we've linked the crowd fund down below, but of course we're going to be talking a bit more about that, and I'll give the people at home a reminder once we've finished talking about it. But let's get into what actually happened, what actually led up to you being sat here today.
Yeah. So this was this sort of started at the end of 2020. So I should say, as a bit of background, I was first a English literature student, and I was sensing I didn't like, already in that degree, I was sensing I didn't like the direction academia was going in. It was very woke.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because what kind of time was this? Because I was in the academic world before I came to do this job, actually.
So it would have been, so I graduated English literature in 2015. And I decided to go into nursing because it was just the complete opposite of academia. I thought I'd just be caring for people, helping people. There won't be any theories or, politics. It's just, it's people, and it won't be, I'll be getting, there's parts of my degree I liked. And I did well in it, but it was a lot of, I did my degree at Sussex, and it was a lot of far left. The professors were very Marxist, and it was just analysing the text through a Marxist perspective all the time. And I was just, by the end of it, I was like, I want to get as far away from this as I can. So I just thought nursing was totally different, and it would give me a whole new set of skills. So I really enjoyed my nurse training. It was nice to be around sane people, just well-rounded people. And so I went into mental health nursing, and the part of my job that I really enjoyed was sort of talking therapy and talking with patients. So I decided, and I'd always been interested in mental health. I was interested in its sort of concepts in literature around madness and reality and philosophical underpinnings of those sorts of things. So I decided to train to become a psychotherapist. So I did my first 2 years at the Tavistock, which at the time was quite a well-renowned. It didn't have the
infamous reputation that it has now. Because it's also worth noting for the people at home, because I think our audience will associate the Tavistock with the child gender clinic, but they also do things like training, don't they? That's completely separate from that, as far as I'm aware, at least.
Yeah, so at the time I was aware that there was a gender identity clinic, but I didn't know much about it. I knew it was separate from my training, and it didn't have all the controversy around it at the time. They do trainings to become psychotherapists or social workers or family therapists, those sorts of things. So I did my first 2 years, and that went fine, and I did really well. And to train to become a psychotherapist, you have to do kind of 4 years. So you do the first 2 years, you get a postgraduate diploma, and then you do the final 2 years. So the first 2 years were fine, and I passed, and I did well. And then I re-enrolled at the end of 2020 to do the final 2 years. So it was quite soon into the degree that I started to notice that the material was very highly politicised and was only pushing one view. And so the first kind of instance of that was when I was asked to attend a lecture titled Race and Racism. And I was expecting this to be maybe like the psychological psychological underpinnings of race and racism, like referencing theories, like not just theories, but like evidence-based theories, looking at it in a broader context. But it was just political. It was about Black Lives Matter. It was about Meghan Markle. And I was like, this is a clinical training.
It's not like there isn't research on
Yeah,
that sort of
exactly.
thing. I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
When I did social psychology modules in my undergrad, we did things on things like xenophobia, and
Yeah.
it was genuinely interesting and
Yeah.
useful to know.
Exactly.
So it sounds like in focusing on the political stuff,
Yes.
that actually removing you from potential time that could be spent actually learning that issue. If they really wanted to talk about racism, they could actually approach it from a more objective, research-focused
Exactly.
avenue.
They didn't reference any kind of research. They were just quoting critical race theorists like Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I didn't come away with any knowledge of kind of like you say, the psychological research around race and racism. And throughout the lecture, there was this thread of essentially being anti-Western and anti-Christian. They kept linking slavery to Christianity and going into all of this. It was like a history lecture that was by someone who wasn't a historian and didn't really know what they were talking about. This is bizarre.
But isn't linking Christianity and slavery wasn't one of the main motivations for the abolition of slavery a Christian worldview?
Yes.
I mean, it is why the British Empire paid all that money that we finally repaid in 2015, I think it was, to enforce the abolition around the world.
Yes, and this is what I mean by it being one-sided. That point of view was not being expressed. I don't mind if it's a balance, but there wasn't a balance. And so at the end of this lecture, I said I sort of expressed this. I said this lecture feels quite politicised, and I'm noticing that you keep singling out Christianity, and I'm curious about why that is. And the lecturer just sort of doubled down and said, well, Christianity is racist because it's European.
What? Jesus, that famous European.
Yeah. So I was like, wow, okay. And then I'd said, look, there's lots of people that don't agree with these ideas. All ethnicities and races don't agree with some of these ideas, and we need to be aware of that. So that happened, and then about a couple of days later, I got sent a link to a Tavistock. It was titled a Tavistock policy seminar, and it was titled "Whiteness: A Problem for Our Time." I was like, okay, I've just had that one lecture where they're saying these very, very suspect things, and now they're sending this round. And I thought, well, maybe it's not as bad as it sounds. I'll give it a fair hearing. And I watched it, and it was just an hour of critical race theory. No balance, no even saying there is a theory called critical race theory, and it says this. It's like, this is the truth. It's not, there's no balance, there's no debate.
Well, I mean, that's bad on multiple levels, really, because on the one hand, I very much disagree with the content of what's being taught there. It seems to me to be explicitly racist and also demeaning to the people who it's meant to be defending.
Yeah, it is.
And on the other hand, it's also, again, taking up valuable time that could be spent looking at more important things. I imagine people who are needing mental health treatment don't want the politics of whiteness shoved down their throat necessarily. I imagine it's also this sort of racial guilt. Putting that upon people who are then going to pass it on to people who are mentally unwell.
Yes, exactly. And who
is
can't cope
incredibly
with it.
dangerous because they're not going to be equipped to understand those ideas in the same way that a mentally well person would.
Exactly.
So it's
exactly
insidious in multiple ways, really.
Yeah, it was, they'd advertised it all across their websites, and they were saying whiteness and racism are the same thing. If a white person says they're not racist, that it's meaningless because they can't not be racist. Like white ignorance, white privilege, white fragility, so on and so forth.
So they had the full roster. So they've got things from Robin DiAngelo there, Ibram X. Kendi, as you mentioned. They've got the whole lot. The whole lot.
And these people aren't clinicians. They're not psychologists. Robin DiAngelo is not a psychologist, or she's she's just a huckster, really. But so I responded to this and said, I'd like to reiterate the point that I made in the lecture, that this is critical race theory. It's an ideology. It's not part of clinical psychology. We need to be aware that, we may be working with patients with a range of views, and not everybody likes these views. And we need to be flexible in our thinking as clinicians, that there's lots of different worldviews, and this is one that most people don't have, actually.
Well, when I've been at university being taught psychology, even when we're being taught something that I consider quite objective, like neuroscience, we're still taught the limitations
Yes.
of those perspectives, even though we have
Yes.
very clear evidence. Like you can say, well, we think these specific psychological processes are located in these areas of the brain, but they still, they show you the neuroimaging.
Yeah.
Like you can see it with your own eyes, and then they still say, well, it's possible that these other processes were active at the same time, or there's still some critical analysis going on there, even in things that are completely apolitical, really.
Yeah. It is quite extraordinary that something for which there's no evidence behind, yet they are so sure of it that there's no debate. And to me, that's a sign that they feel weak in their arguments, because, like you said, if it's a genuine exploration of truth, there would be that debate. But they don't want the argument, is essentially.
I don't think there's much critical thinking going on with the people who actually buy into this sort of thing,
No,
because
not whatsoever. No.
more often than not, it has more in common with a form of theology than it does with some sort of critical science or even a political science.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I thought my response was quite like opening up a conversation, and I thought it was quite reasonable, given the fact that some of the things that they were saying were quite, discriminatory. So after I sent that email, I got pulled into a meeting with the course lead, and it was quite an intimidating kind of tone to the meeting.
I can imagine. Yeah. Just being called into the meeting is intimidating enough.
Yeah.
Without then the content
kind of like
of the
we need
conversation.
to speak. It was like, we need to speak about your reaction to that lecture. I was like, okay. And she said that because of my views, the course might not be right for me. I said, are the views in this lecture, this whiteness for a problem of our time, is this the views of that particular lecturer, or is this the view of the Tavistock? And she said, I think it would be the view of the whole Tavistock. And I said, but she's putting forth the idea that all white people are racist. And she said, yeah, that's kind of what we think here.
Do you think that perhaps they were being somewhat truthful about the atmosphere in the Tavistock? Do you think
Possibly.
that everyone
I don't know.
would buy into that? Because
yeah.
It does seem like there is certainly an unusual amount of ideologically motivated so-called medicine going on there.
Yeah. She later said, well, it's a bit like the way there's an inherent sexism in all men. And I said, well, yeah.
Great.
I said, well, I don't agree with that either. And she just, it's like, and what they do is they refer to the fact that they're a, quote, anti-racist organisation, and that the British Psychological Council is an anti-racist organisation. So they're sort of saying, look, all our organisations are anti-racism, and this is what anti-racism is. And if you don't go along with it, then, there's something not right about you, or you're not right for this course, essentially.
Well, it's funny they say that, because what's called anti-racism is about raising racial consciousness, isn't it? It's about trying to make people aware of race. But there are many psychological theories that suggest that if you're made aware of something, well, then it's more salient in your mind, and therefore you're more likely to act upon these sorts of things. So if you're told that, these are the stereotypes that white people think about minorities. Well, if you have them in your mind, you're more likely to think of them, and therefore more likely to potentially act on them, which is actually the findings of the government in why they ban things like unconscious bias training and diversity training, because they found the actual scientific research found that there's a backfire effect in that it can make people more racist than when they started. And that's because of this mental salience that it creates, whereby by raising racial consciousness, you mysteriously, I couldn't have predicted this, make people more racist.
Because you become fixated on it. You become, you're conscious of it. You become almost paranoid about how you're coming across and what you should say and what you shouldn't say, and people pick up on that.
Well, it's also unfair to the people who you're meant to be treating better.
Yes.
Because then you're having to treat them differently to people within your own supposed race.
Yeah.
And I don't think people want to be spoken to like you're stepping on eggshells. They want to be spoken to like a normal human being.
Yeah.
It's like the Martin Luther King quote of the content of the character rather than the colour of their skin. I think that
exactly.
people don't necessarily care about what people make of them.
Well, I said in this meeting, I said to her, well, my view of not being racist is just that, not judging a person by the colour of their skin, treating people equally. And she said, well, we see that as discredited and outdated now in the field. That's just discredited by who?
Yeah.
Let me see that, authority which has discredited that view. Like, I don't. It's just discredited in their heads that they've just decided it.
That's such an absurd thing that I don't even know where to go to discredit that in return, if you know what I mean. Like, who's... I mean, a critical race theorist now just signing off on, who's acceptable, who's not, who's got the right ideas.
Yeah.
The people we hold at the very top of our society, or at least according to that person.
Yeah, it can, and like you said, it can change because there's no evidence behind it. It can change at any whim. So it's just totally insane. It feels like the complete opposite of clinical psychology, of what it should be. So after this meeting, I was just kind of shocked, and I was like, oh gosh, I'm paying money into this institution. What do I do? Should I quit? Should I continue? And I really don't want to stay. So I decided I thought, well, maybe it's just this one course lead, and I should say something. Maybe people in higher positions won't agree with this. So I decided to make a complaint to the complaints department, and I just outlined what had been said, and I just explained that it's against the Equalities Act. You're treating people differently based on their race and sex as well. If you're saying that all men are inherently sexist, like, I don't know why anybody can be sexist. It's not, And then I also mentioned what they said about Christianity. So they got back to me. They said they were going to look into it. They were going to do an investigation, and they were taking it seriously. And then a couple of days later, I got an email again from the course lead about my progress, essentially saying I was doing well with my patients. But the board, like the progression board, had noticed that my personal views weren't in keeping with their anti-racist thinking.
Well, that seems ridiculous. Obviously, the fact that they're enforcing anti-racism at all is ridiculous, but also the fact that you're doing well with your patients, surely that should be first and foremost. I mean, I'm not actually a clinician, but I at least know that in clinical practice, the well-being of your patients is the main thing.
Yeah, and it was quite concerning, because essentially what they are saying repeatedly is that you can't disagree with this. So it's, you've got to go along with this ideology. And if they tell you essentially you're not anti-racist enough, it sort of implies that they think that you're racist, right?
Because of course,
yeah, which is not nice to be accused of. So I was still quite shocked by that. And they continue, even though they were supposed to be investigating my complaint, they continued to send reading material to me that was, again, Robin DiAngelo, much of the same stuff, much of the same ideas. So I just noted that. I didn't say anything. And then I was asked, kind of at a review of the term, I was actually asked by the course lead if there's anything about the course I didn't like so far. So I said, well, now that you ask, I actually don't like this recent reading material that's been sent. I've already flagged up that this is discriminatory, and you're continuing to send it round. And I just explained, I said, Robin DiAngelo is not a clinician. This isn't evidence-based. It's racist. And she told me to stop speaking. And then she raised a student conduct policy against me. So that's the first of the kind of disciplinary proceedings to remove you from the course.
Okay.
So it's just
that's a bit extreme.
That's really extreme.
Some, quite frankly, mild criticism of the content of the course.
Yeah. And the academic freedom to be like, as a student, surely am I supposed to ask and like be curious and say, is this evidence-based? What's the psychological research about these ideas? That's what a good student should do, is to try to learn and try to ask questions. And they don't want you to ask questions. So how am I supposed to be a student?
Well, it sounds like to me that they were trying to, in a way, brainwash people into making these ideologies their foundational presumptions about the world, and then building the other things on top of that. But if you're going into a clinical practice with those kinds of presumptions, that's going to do untold damage, as I alluded to earlier, in that you've got this inaccurate view of the world that isn't based on evidence, that's apportioning blame on people, and can be used to seriously hurt people if used against the wrong person. Yeah,
exactly, and used in the wrong way. And they don't put any caveats, or they don't put any, you need to be careful. There's none of that. It's just they just put all these radical statements out there with no consideration. It's quite remarkable. So and I got this nasty email telling me that from the course lead, telling me that she didn't think I should be able to become a psychotherapist, that I was all sorts of things. She said I created a traumatizing environment just by disagreeing.
But
this is a misuse of psychological. They're misusing psychological terminology against people. They're weaponizing it, like trauma. Disagreeing with something and saying these statements aren't evidence-based, that's not traumatizing.
I know people who are practicing mental health nurses, and they have to be quite psychologically hardy because of the content of their jobs. Some of the stories I've been told, I was like, wow, that would take a toll on me. I'm not sure I could do that day in, day out. And if you're being made to feel like, I can't remember the exact word you used.
Like I was creating a traumatizing environment.
Traumatizing, which is also a very strong word. But if you're being traumatized by some mild intellectual criticism, then quite frankly, you're the person that's not fit for the course, in my opinion. By being skeptical, that makes you better at what you're doing, not worse.
Yes. So it raised alarm bells with me around these people, the teachers, because how are they managing disagreement with their patients? If a patient says, I don't agree, how are they managing conflict with patients, or just more broadly? There seems to be an absolute hypersensitivity, which is a kind of neuroticism. That's not a good thing. That's what that's what you try to help a patient get away from, not encourage it. So, and so they were doing this so-called investigation, and into my complaint, the investigator got back to me and essentially doubled down on the ideology. She said, we encourage all our students to interrogate whiteness. She said that they'd realised that while the view of whiteness as a system of power and privilege wasn't in their official policy, they should make it their policy. So they're actually saying that they need to do more of it, not less.
Which is just insane in and of itself.
Yeah, I was just like, how could you write that in an official document that we need to put this ideology into our policy? It was madness. And I was thinking, and the further I got along the complaints procedure, and the more they just doubled down, more people just said, yeah, that's what we think. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. And yeah, they didn't follow any of their own policies or procedures. They raised this student conduct policy against me. They were supposed to meet with me, hear my side of the story. They didn't do any of that. They just sent a letter to my house saying that if you continue speaking inappropriately, you may be suspended. They don't say what I've said. They won't quote me on what I've said that's inappropriate, because I've said, what have I said? Speaking inappropriately about race, what? Because I would say they're speaking inappropriately about race. Sending a lecture around called Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time, to me, that's an inappropriate statement about race, or all these other statements. So it's just they decide what the reality is, basically, at the Tavistock. It's not...
But it's not even representative of clinical practice.
No, it's not.
I'm quite familiar with some clinical research, though it's not necessarily my specialisation, but a lot of the time things are explained in terms of, say, neurological damage, or patterns of bad behaviour, childhood abuse, addiction, these sorts of things that seem quite intuitive to most people that aren't even clinicians. So the fact that these things have been inserted in, it's not like it's some innocent mistake. It's clearly what I would call as being malevolent.
And I don't think they think of themselves as malevolent. They think of themselves as, that they're ushering in the utopia, that they're doing good, that they're, and someone like me needs to be squashed because I'm bad. But it is, like you said, that's very all or nothing thinking. It's like there's goodies and there's baddies, and the baddies need to be shut up and treated like they're a heretic.
It's quite an infantile way of looking at the world.
It is.
If it's just good and bad people, I mean, that might work in films, but it's not actually the reality of the situation. There are lots of shades of grey in the middle there.
Yeah, there's no shades of grey at the Tavistock. It's just extraordinary. I feel like the average person on the street has more psychological awareness an understanding of psychology than they do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're actually more sane, just a random person. You could pick a random person and they'd probably be like more well-rounded.
I can believe it. It seems like they're completely ideologically captured in there.
Yeah. So at that stage, I just felt like everyone's against me at this point. And even the CEO's response to my complaint was essentially just to say, we are an anti-racist organisation. And I was like, yeah, but I'm showing you that you're saying things that are racist. And he's just like, we are an anti-racist organisation. And you're just going around in circles. There's no critical thinking. It's just, they parrot just dogma at you. So I started thinking about, you know, the direction that the profession is going in as a whole. It's interesting. I actually attended a group last night with some group of psychologists who are all concerned about what's happening in the field. And this is happening not just at the Tavistock. It's happening on clinical psychology courses at universities. They're having seminars about whiteness and, you know, etc.
It's funny you say that, because my experience of university, I started in 2015 because I spent a bit of time between school working before going to university, which I very much recommend people do, by the way. And I found it was all quite evidence-based. Like
That's good.
My contact with wokeness in universities was when I was going to political speeches that were completely separate from that. It was more of a sort of hobby.
Yes.
Because funnily enough, I am interested in politics.
Yeah.
But both my undergraduate and postgraduate courses were completely fine.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't have any of this shoved down my throat. So it seems like there is at least some degree of at least resistance, or maybe it's just that it hasn't got there yet and it's one of the last things to fall. But I would like to...
Yeah, I think it's going in that direction pretty quickly. There's lots, I think even like in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, things have ramped up in terms of these DEI, you know, all of that stuff that's been pushed through. But it's, as you said, I mean, if you're a clinician, that one thing you're taught from the beginning is that when you're with a patient, you have to be non-judgmental, neutral. You're not coming in with an agenda. You're not putting your ideas onto them. You're thinking about what's best for them, which, you know, you try to keep much as your personal stuff to the side. You're not, you know, you're not talking about what you think or what you would do. You're helping them. So the whole critical social justice woke ideology, it just goes against that. You know, the basic principles of being a clinician, it undermines.
And of course, you can look at some of the main advocates of it, and you can see neuroticism embodied within their very behaviour.
It's like, yeah, they're hysterical. They catastrophise. They jump to conclusions. They're making generalisations about whole groups of people. It's all or nothing thinking. It's like it ticks everything that you would try to help a patient not do. You know, it's like the opposite. It's like the reverse of CBT. It's encouraging negative thinking. It's encouraging paranoia, and it's like it's just crazy to see that you're being taught ideas that would actually make someone worse. They wouldn't encourage the person to feel better about themselves. They'd actually feel, you know, making them feel ashamed of their identity. You know, and I'm seeing this in my practice as a nurse. I'm seeing this coming through a little bit in the teenagers that I treat, because I work in CAMS. And that there is, you know, they are expressing guilt and shame about being white and about being privileged and all these sorts of ideas. It's not good. It's not, you know, it's making them feel worse.
Oh, well, I don't doubt it, especially if you're a teenager. You don't have the ability to necessarily think critically about these sorts of things. And of course, although I disagree with the framing in its entirety, I mean, critical race theory seems to pose whiteness to mean European, or more specifically Anglo-European or British. But there are many good things that Britain has given to the world that we can be proud of. I mean, our contributions in World War II of spreading things like parliamentary democracy, and there are lots of things that they completely overlook, but they will also, on the other hand, speak about positively. I mean, ending slavery is something that we can be proud of, but of course, I don't think that you need to be monolithic about people's so-called race, which I don't necessarily even believe exists. I mean, defining groups is harmful anyway.
As soon as you start even applying any critical thinking to critical race theory, it doesn't make sense, because you think, well, what about Asian people? What about a Chinese person? Do they have whiteness? Do they have power and privilege? Do they what
when you actually look at the data as well,
they do, they do.
They perform better,
Yeah.
particularly in things like British universities.
Yeah.
While Chinese students, Indian students, I think Nigerian students outperform
Yes.
British students.
Yeah, and there's lots of inequalities around white working class boys and educational disadvantages there. So it just doesn't make any sense. It's actually racist to everyone in some way. And yeah, I mean, when they use these phrases like white ignorance, it's like, well, is there a form of Asian ignorance then? Is there a form of Jewish ignorance? Is it just a particular type of ignorance that just white people have? And what is that? Like, none of it makes sense.
By defining it by the so-called group, it's making an implicit argument that there are other forms of ignorances or problems with other groups as well, which seems to be...
Which is actually things like ignorance or fragility. They don't actually have any intrinsic relationship to race. Like you could be any ethnicity or race and be ignorant about anything. So it just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent about critical race theory. Where were we?
So after so I was kind of coming towards the end of my first year of training. All my clinical work was going well, but it was just these ideas that I was disagreeing with and them just shutting me down. So at that point, I was seeking legal advice. I'd already paid for the first year and I'd gotten through the first year, but it felt like the whole institution was essentially saying, we catch you out one more time, you'll be suspended.
So at this point, you'd done at least 3 years towards, and you only had a year left.
Yes, that's correct.
So you had a lot on the line really here.
Yeah,
because of course, that would be what would be the equivalent of an entire undergraduate degree. And I imagine if you went up to a university student who was about to graduate and said, would you risk losing your qualification for standing up for your beliefs? I imagine if polled privately, that a lot of them would be like, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. I think at that stage, I just was so angry about the state of the profession, and it was like I said, the direction it was going in. And it was really hard because I'd been working towards this for years and saving up for the tuition fees, etc. And I'd put a lot of time and money into trying to make it work. So I was speaking to lawyers and I was thinking if I'm going to take legal action against them, I'm going to have to, get some money. I didn't have much money. So I got a crowdfund going.
Which we've linked down below, by the way.
GoFundMe Stand Up to Woke. Which is what it's called, and we released a bit of press about it in January of this year to try to get some money, which was good. I felt a bit more confident that it's something I could do, and then they just continued to bully me after that, and I couldn't believe the arrogance and how bold they were, that they knew I was taking legal action, or they knew that I was at least thinking about it because they'd seen it in the press. And they were just continuing to overtly kind of bully me and do things to me.
Because that seems quite either naive or they're so content in their position of power that they're kind of lording it over you.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously what you've gone through and the fact that you're taking them to court, I imagine there have been many people who haven't done that, but it takes a lot of bravery to do something like that, especially to put your all your work on the line, potentially. Yeah,
it was a big thing, but I just sort of thought, I got some legal advice and I thought I've got a good case here. These things are against the Equalities Act. You can't say certain things about one race and focus on one particular race without any evidence and not say and single out certain groups. So, but after I got that media attention in January, so one of the lecturers wrote to the Nursing Midwifery Council, which is like my regulatory body as a nurse. Gosh, what she wrote was just insane. It was like she said that the fact that I showed ignorance around slavery and therefore I shouldn't be a nurse. And it's like, you don't have to be a historian to be a nurse. Like it's always good to be knowledgeable about history, but that's actually not what nursing is. Like that's not a reason why I shouldn't be a nurse. And I'm actually not ignorant about slavery, but and she said that I'd caused race-based harm. I'd racially harassed her. I'd never even mentioned her race. She just said the fact that I was taking legal action against the Tavistock was a racial harassment of her. It's like, how?
Surely that betrays far more about her own state of mind.
No, it's all projection.
Yeah.
They've all got their own issues, and they're projecting it onto everyone else, and they can't see that they're doing it. She said that my Twitter account made her feel unsafe. This was like a genuine complaint to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and it was just laughable. It was like,
if someone said to me, "Oh, your Twitter account makes me feel unsafe," I would advise them seeing a psychologist themselves.
Yes,
just
I feel like you've clearly got anxiety. Like that you've got a hypersensitivity which you need some help with. Like you've got a kind of negative thinking that you need to address.
This sort of hypersensitivity to opposing opinions it's so strange that it's captured an area you would think that would be quite immune to it. I mean, with the knowledge of mental health, you think that there would be at least some self-awareness of the symptoms they're experiencing.
Yeah, it's it's like they're just in this bubble, and it really is like that. And I
can certainly believe it. It certainly sounds like
it's
that.
like, not until you experience it, you just think, are you not engaging with the outside world at all? Like, are you not talking to people that think differently to you? Maybe they're not, I don't know, but it's just, you couldn't make it up. It's even worse than I thought it would be. So yeah, that she made this complaint to the Nursing and Midwifery Council were really good. They took quite a long time to get back, but they just shut it down basically. They said, look, they contacted my place of work, they spoke to my manager, and they said, look, there's no evidence of this person ever being racist. I've never had any complaint against me. They said, students should be able to voice disagreements. We have no issue with a nurse doing that, and you're actually not entitled to have a nurse that agrees with critical race theory. Nurses are allowed to have their own views. So they were quite reasonable, which was quite good. But then since then, other things. So I was in my sort of second year, and other things started to happen. So the course lead, we were doing seminars over Zoom. We were about to go into having seminars in person. And then she basically gave a speech to all the students saying she's decided that we're not meeting in person because she feels that my hate speech is easier to manage over Zoom. And
that's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
What, if you say something she doesn't like, she's just going to mute you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think so. Yeah. And that, she just said I'd made derogatory comments, and that which I haven't. I've not said anything. They can't quote anything that I've said. And she said hate speech is different from free speech, and what we've experienced is hate speech. So it's just this dogma. It's like they've been taken over. They're just not thinking. It's just incredible, really.
Yeah, although I've been keeping up with a lot of this stuff, and I've been following it for years now, it's still surprising to hear the extent to which people are willing to bury their heads in the sand from what seems to me to be an obvious reality that what they're saying isn't true. Yeah,
it's felt like, I've worked on psychiatric wards, and I've managed kind of patients with personality disorders, and as a nurse on that sort of ward, you're always having to maintain the boundaries and have a kind of objectivity and kind of have a kind of rational view of what's going on and think quite carefully. And it's felt like I'm managing those sorts of patients, but it's the staff. I'm having to, every time they do something, I felt like I'm being a psychiatric nurse to the staff at the Tavistock. So every time they say I'll do something inappropriate, I have to just go back to the complaints department, say, this is what was said, this is why it's a breach of your policies, and it shouldn't be happening, and this is why. And I just have to keep sort of managing them, like managing their behaviour. And it's like, you're not the patients. Like, I'm not supposed to be managing you. It's just like a complete inversion. It's like, you're supposed to be teaching me, and I'm having to manage your behaviour. It
reminds me actually of something that people used to say to me when I was at university to wind me up, saying, "Oh, you're a psychologist, so what's wrong with you then?"
Yeah.
But obviously they were saying it to be a bit tongue in cheek. But it seems like there's something going on here.
I think
to vindicate that for you, actually.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of people that go into the profession because they've got, issues of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying anybody who's experienced mental health problems shouldn't become a psychologist or at all.
I think it probably gives people quite a good perspective as long as they're serious about pursuing it.
Yeah, exactly. But you've also got to have a professional boundary around that.
Of course,
you can't put your problems onto the patients or the people you're teaching, or so yeah, it's been quite extraordinary. But even since then, they stopped. So I was seeing luckily I got to finish my work with one patient and that went really well, and I started seeing another patient and they decided to stop me seeing that patient. The director of the clinic, who's also the head of medical psychotherapy within the Royal College of Psychiatrists, her name's Dr. Jessica Yakeley, she just told me that I'm unsafe to see patients. And the reason she gave for this was because I knocked on a door and I asked for the noise level to be reduced because it was interrupting my session with a patient. And she said,
perfectly
reasonable.
Normal practice. Yeah.
Not at the Tavistock, it's not. if you offered somebody a biscuit at the Tavistock and they didn't want a biscuit, it would be like you've traumatized them.
It's a microaggression, as they would say.
Yeah, it's a microaggression. So she said that by knocking on the door, I'd left the people in the room traumatized. Yeah, she said that.
That is ridiculous.
They keep using this word trauma about anything they don't like. And she stopped me seeing my patient because of this. She told me that I shouldn't go into the reception area because if the people in the room saw me again, they'd be re-traumatized by the sight of me. This is a psychiatrist who's in quite a powerful position. And I was
it makes me wonder what's gone wrong here for that person to end up in that position.
I don't know. I don't know if there's an internal power dynamics at play where they all feel they've got to back each other up. I don't fully. I'm still trying to process it and understand it myself. Mm-hmm. But there is a groupthink going on, and there is. I don't know. I think maybe they think that it's sort of my word against theirs, and if they all gang up on me, they'll squash me. It's actually not my word against theirs. I can prove quite a lot of this. So, so I don't know if it's that. But yeah, she's suspended. She essentially told me I'm unsafe to see patients, and she said there would be an investigation into me. That was in April of this year.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you hadn't actually done anything wrong.
No.
We're talking to your patients.
No.
It's just them being silly about things.
Yeah. And we're now in October and I've had no written or formal correspondence about it whatsoever. I've sent, there's an external investigation going on now and another internal investigation. I essentially said, well, what's going on? Because have you suspended me? Or I haven't had any, I was told I was being investigated, but I've had you haven't followed any of your investigation protocol. And I'm still, to this day, I don't know. I don't know what they're doing.
That's very strange because you would think that they would at least tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
Rather than keeping you in the dark. I think maybe they're trying to get things in order behind the scenes for the legal case, maybe, and then they're trying to keep you at arm's length for as long as possible to give them as much time to sort it out. But then I don't know how these things tend to work.
But I'm not backing down on the legal case, so we'll have to see.
Well, good.
Yeah. Yeah, so I should maybe speak about the legal case,
sure, yeah.
if that's okay. Yeah, so we have served court documents to them where we've agreed a stay. We've added some more incidents that they've done onto the original particulars of claim. But what I'm in the process of now is raising money for the legal case. I'm in the process of getting some expert witnesses in the field to testify against these ideas, to actually say that they're not part of clinical psychology. There's no evidence base for them.
I suppose that shouldn't be too difficult to prove. It's just a matter of finding the experts, really.
Yeah, and that actually it could be potentially harmful. Like critical race theory is not proven, and it's like, as you said, there's no psychological research behind it, and they're just rolling it out like it's the truth. So yeah, I think I've seen lots of news reports about critical race theory in the civil service, in primary schools, in secondary schools, in lots of professions, actually. But we haven't seen any significant legal cases yet. So I'm really hoping that this could have quite a big influence and quite a big impact, potentially.
I'm certainly hoping so.
Yeah, I'm hoping so.
Best of luck with it as well. But
Yeah.
it's certainly worth paying attention to if you're at home, because this will, if it's successful, set a precedent
Yes.
for other areas. So
Yes.
it'll make it much easier for other people to then take these organisations to court. I know that I think it was she was the Equalities Minister at the time, Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah.
She tried to ban it from the civil service, and even though formally it was illegal, we had members of the civil service leaking stuff to us, telling us that it's still going on, just under a different name instead. So they're trying to get around it. So it seems like there are lots of nefarious actors in organisations trying to sneak it in through the back door, even if it's been formally banned. So I think the courts hitting people in their wallet is probably the best way to go.
Yeah. I think it's been, I think, until people properly fight back in a legal sense, they'll just keep finding other ways of doing it. There's lots of psychology courses now where it's part of their curriculum. It just needs to be stopped. It's, like I said, it's against the Equalities Act. It's against all the sort of regulations of being a clinician as well. I've seen some of these ideas coming through even in my nursing a little bit, which is worrying. Like, I was, told to talk to certain patients Black Lives Matter, and that I should treat people differently depending on their race. And it's, the Tavistock is part of the NHS. It's not, this isn't a academic course. It's a training to work with vulnerable people, and it's taxpayer funded, and they are forcing people to adopt these ideas essentially. Hopefully we can put a stop to that if I'm successful in this case.
Fingers crossed.
Yes, yeah.
So how have you found the support for this case so far? Because I listed at the start all of the media outlets, and also I know that Lawrence Fox as well has spoken to you. How's that been so far?
Yeah, it's been really helpful to get that support, because throughout all of this, I've essentially been on my own with it for quite a long time, which is really maddening. It's so hard when people in positions of power, all the way up to the CEO, essentially telling you, no, there's something wrong with you, and you feel like everyone's against you. And as I've had more and more support, even in the last month or so, it's been really helpful. And being put in contact with other clinicians or psychologists who also see that there's an issue here. I was speaking to a clinical psychologist last night who essentially said, if this woke ideology takes over, there is no such thing as clinical psychology, because this is the complete opposite of clinical psychology. And if we allow it to take over, our profession's essentially over.
I've spoken to, this was going back a few years now, about 7 years maybe, but I was speaking to some academics and professors about this because it was on my radar relatively early, just because I was quite plugged into the politics side of things. But I spoke to them and they were quite concerned, and they were just hoping, keeping their heads down and hoping that it would go away.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not going to name any names, so I'm not going to make anyone lose their job, but quite a few people who I tentatively brought it up to, as soon as they realised that I was being critical of it, it was like a breath of fresh air, and they're like, oh yes, well, this and this is all wrong, and these sorts of things. So there are people certainly there in institutions that dislike it, and dislike it for the same reasons that we seem to, in that they see it as counter to what they've been spending their careers doing. And it's very frustrating, but at least there are some people there. I know that there are plenty of media outlets that are pushing against this all the time. We talk about this sort of thing every day, and we've managed to accumulate a reasonable following in the 2 years that we've been running now. So
there is that support out there, and that's really good. But I think I don't think it is going away. People keep saying, we've hit the peak, or even with the closure of the gender identity clinic, you think they'd maybe be a bit cautious about what they say and do going forward, but they don't seem to be. So
I think we're right in the midst of it. I think people are slowly having to take sides almost, and I hate to put it in such sort of polar terms, but it seems to me that people are either siding with that sort of thing or against it, and there's not really much room to be in the middle. But then again, I also think that you can't really mediate with something that's so totalizingly condemning of things like white people or Anglo culture, all these sorts of things, just throwing it all out and saying it's blanketly racist. Well, you can't debate with that person because they're not making evidence-based assertions that can be disproved. They're just saying it like a form of belief.
It's a theology. So you can't have a rational discussion about it. But yeah, I mean, the pushback against some of the trans stuff has been good. There's been quite a few legal cases against the trans stuff, which has been good. And I think that is shifting. But I think with the anti-racism side of things, that hasn't got as much attention as the trans stuff, like critical race theory, in this country at least. In America, it's getting a lot of attention. But here, it's not. There's not been. We found any legal cases against it. So yeah, hopefully the pushback starts here, I guess.
There are quite a few cases against the Tavistock at the minute, aren't there?
Yeah.
I know one of the famous ones that actually got overturned was Kira Bell. That was the gender clinic side of things. But I know that the head of safeguarding at the Tavistock is also suing them along similar reasons, I think, that they were basically being diverted rather than referring actual safeguarding concerns to her and allowing her to do her job, which is an important one. They were just avoiding her entirely.
Yeah, I think they sort of applied similar tactics that they've done to me, kind of intimidation, bullying, sidelining. She actually won her case, so that was great. But they've just got this modus operandi of just bullying. And they can't seem to, like I said, it's so extraordinary that they don't seem to have any kind of psychological awareness. You'd think, well, hang on, if patients and staff keep suing us, maybe there's something wrong with our ideas. What do they think all these lawsuits are about? Maybe they just think the law is itself a part of the white supremacist system. I don't know.
I think they might just be doubling down a little bit in that in their mind they're fighting against this racist white supremacist system, and therefore people are going to push back against them, and therefore they can say, well, this is evidence that we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, we're weeding out the dissenters, and that's good. And we're getting rid of the clinicians who aren't anti-racist enough. Yeah.
So just to reiterate, if people want to support your case, which I very much advise people to do, they can find it in that GoFundMe link down below, both on the website and on YouTube clips, which are eventually going to go up as well. Yeah. So unless there's anything else you want to add.
No, like I said, it's GoFundMe Stand Up to Woke, and this is going to cost me a fortune. So I need as much money as possible. So if you've got anything spare, please help me.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me, and also thank you very much for what you're doing as well, because I think it's very much the right thing to do, and it requires a lot of bravery to do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.